on the rise, alcohol and drug use are on the rise. So the stress is starting to take its toll.
Tonight, the biggest mortgage meltdown.
The thing that makes people most stressed out is when they don't feel like they have any control.
The medical community has begun to accept the notion that for cardiovascular disease, for depression, for certain disorders, that there is a very clear, inescapable link with stress. We're increasingly aware of the important role that inflammation plays. Inflammation is part of everything from cancer to Alzheimer's disease to arthritis to diabetes to cardiovascular disease, you name it. And psychological stress elevates the inflammatory cytokines, just as an overload of calories, just as many of these things.
There is a kind of biological embedding, if you will, a biological fingerprint that is left by experiences of growing up in disadvantage. And there are both short-term changes in the biology of children who are exposed to those kinds of settings, but there appear to be longer-term changes as well. May affect their development, may potentially affect things as distant as when they die, the chronic diseases that they develop over the course of their adult life, their mental health over the years of their adult life.
So is there a biology of misfortune? More on that provocative proposal later. We're talking stress, the all-pervasive feeling of worry, of burden, of overload and uncertainty, and crucially, of loss of control. Last week, an article in the New York Times captured my attention. It told the story of 3 men, all in relatively good health, having heart attacks within weeks of being laid off from the steel mills in New York. I think the stress just got to him, said Kim Smith of her 42-year-old husband Bob. Well, today on the show, you might be blown away by what science is revealing about stress in the body and brain, in children and in all of us. This is All in the Mind, and I'm Natasha Mitchell.
I think of it as being almost kind of like an archaeological dig, if you will. You begin with the lived experience of the child, the adversity and stressful events that child encounters. That is experienced by the child within circuitry of the brain. So we begin this archaeology by exploring what are the brain structures and functions that are changed by early exposure. Then you dig down a little further, a little smaller in scale and complexity, and there are differences in the cellular level and the communication between neurons within the brain, the kind of neurotransmitter systems that are present in the brain. And then a little deeper are the subcellular kinds of processes like the epigenetic changes that we now are seeing that are also systematically different between low and high disadvantaged children.
And by epigenetic, you're referring to not the genetics of a person, but the cellular architecture that influences which genes are switched on and off in a body, which is very much affected, as we're finding out, by our environment, by what we're exposed to, our parenting, what we eat.
Exactly. The metaphor that I like to think about in this regard is that when we move, we pack all of our stuff in boxes, right? And boxes are great for moving from one place to another, but they're not very good for actually using the stuff that's in them. So we have to unpack these boxes of genes in order to use the genes, to express them, to have them guide the development of proteins that they code for. And epigenetics is this business of the packaging of the genome and the way in which it influences the expression of genes in a differential manner.
Pediatrician Professor Tom Boyce, and both my guests today think it's time policymakers took notice of biological evidence in their planning. First to the man whose research has really defined the study of stress. Professor Bruce McEwen from Rockefeller University is a neuroscientist and a neuroendocrinologist. Well, Bruce, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's good to be talking with you.
Stress operates paradoxically, doesn't it? In the one sense, a modicum of stress keeps us on our toes. Too much is a problem. I mean, the brain reacts to stress but it also adapts to stress, doesn't it? Tell us about that paradox.
Well, I think the best way to start is to talk about the different ways we think of stress. There is positive stress when you rise to a challenge and generally are exhilarated because you're able to meet that challenge. And it means you have to have a good sense of yourself, a good sense of whether the risk is worth taking, good self-esteem, and a good sense of control.